Hello, welcome to Daily Visual. My name is Craig, and today we are going to talk about visual patterns. Visual patterns are basically formats that you can follow to make better visuals on Twitter, on Instagram, pretty much anywhere really that you'd want to make better visuals. This is Office Hours 3 of Daily Visual. So in a couple of the other ones that we've already done, we spoke about visual metaphors, we spoke a little bit about visuals as a whole, but visual patterns are really the thing that begins everything. If we were to use a metaphor of writing, for example, visual patterns are the choice of sentence structure that you are going to use to make something. Visual metaphors would be the words and the grammar choices that you make after you've decided what sentences to use, and then the resulting visual would be the completed piece as a whole. And today we're going to focus on visual patterns. So what is a visual pattern? A visual pattern is quite literally a format choice. It's an established pattern that you can use to be sure that your visual is going to get understood by a larger amount of people. I've decided to focus on 12 visuals in this lesson that we're going to cover, and I've picked examples from my own work, which is the ones on the bottom, my own obvious account. I've picked excellent examples from Carl Richards, which is Behavior Gap, and then obviously I've picked the god, which is Jack Butcher, of Visualized Value. And we're going to look through each of these, put some format and some pattern to them. I've got 3 different visual patterns that I want to discuss. There's many more that I am cataloguing at the minute and trying to fit into buckets of the way that these images work and why that they work. But we're going to focus on 3 specific visual formats, visual patterns today that I think are the most important for you to learn. And we're going to start with the most important one, the transformation. The transformation is one of the most popular formats, visual patterns that I see on Twitter, Instagram, and elsewhere really. I see this pattern in advertising. I see this pretty much anywhere where you need to make a really strong visual and you want to make something that you know is going to impact a large amount of people. And a transformation is quite simple really. It's taking a certain set of elements from one state to another. In a super simplified format, it looks something like this. We have 4 lines on the left hand side, and then on the right hand side we have the resulting square that comes from that. It's a very simple format that you can see, understand instantly without any text really. It doesn't need anything else. You understand what is happening here. Something is moving through one state to another. That is what a transformation is. It is the transformation. There's a couple of rules that you need to follow for these. I think that these kind of images, transformations, work best when they show a progression. The whole point of them is to show something moving from one state through to another. So you are using the format to tell a story, ideally, and that's what we want to get out of it. And then also, I think they work best when there is 2 panels, there is 2 progressions. That is not the only way to do this. There is many other ways to show a transformation of something. But I think they work best when you use 2 strong states and move between them. And then finally, the most important part of this is that you need to retain the same elements across both. If you add elements into the second state or you remove elements from the first state, it doesn't kind of make sense as a whole piece. And someone would look at it and they'd think too much about trying to figure out the visual instead of understanding the visual in an instant. And that is one of the most important points when you're making visuals like this. Remember where they are going to go. If they're going on Twitter, then people are scrolling through the timeline. They're not going to spend much time really analysing what's going on. If they're going on a billboard, for example, people are driving past. They ain't going to spend much time understanding what they're seeing. So it's important that the understanding behind them is instantaneous. Somebody can't be expected to sit and think and figure out your puzzle. So these are examples that I want to go through, and I'm going to focus on a few key ones here of the transformation methodology. As you can see here, straight away, just looking at these 5 images that we're going to talk about, you can see a progression from one thing to another, and nearly every single one of these examples uses the same elements on the left and progresses and transforms into something on the right. It's a very, very, very established visual pattern that's used a lot. And you can see on the left here, in the top left-hand corner, from visualize value, what's happened with this one is this isn't a transformation between two forms, but the simplicity of it still makes sense. It is going from a blurry circle to a very refined circle, so it's still very easy to understand, even though the circle is going actually through 5 states and not just 2. Let's begin with a visualized value image. This is one that Jack Butcher did recently, and the quotation that goes with it is, "Any fool can know, the point is to understand," by Albert Einstein. This is a perfect example, almost a classic example of the transformation. It takes elements on the left-hand side. In this case, the overall picture of this is that we're using a very, very established visual metaphor, which is Tetris. Everybody knows what Tetris is, and anytime you can get a pop culture reference into a visual as well, especially such a highly understood visual metaphor like this, which is Tetris, it's definitely going to impact much higher and hit much harder than something that most people wouldn't understand. So using Tetris in this instance is genius, and it shortcuts the understanding. That's what visual metaphors are. It's something we discussed last week in Office Hours 2 when I was talking about how you use visual metaphors to shortcut somebody's understanding so they can figure something out much quicker. So in this image, we take in the state of kind of a mess, really. We've got a mess of pieces, a poor layout of Tetris. If you were playing Tetris, you wouldn't get many points for this layout that you've got here on the left. And then on the right-hand side, we've got something much neater. It looks complete. And we can clearly see that the point of this on the right-hand side is a much cleaner and smarter layout. So we're moving from something that is negative on the left to something that is positive on the right. Often we see in these transformations that something goes from a mess on the left through to an understanding on the right. That's quite intentional. Most of us read from left to right. Most of us understand things from left to right. So it makes sense to make the thing on the left messy or incomplete, and the thing on the right to be complete and the desired effect that we wanted to achieve. One from my unobvious account, this quotation, "Everything you can imagine is real," by Pablo Picasso. I'm utilizing the same methodology here of a transformation, but also a pop culture reference. I've, on the right hand side, made an image out of circles and arrows, which looks a little bit like a Picasso painting. So if you know who Picasso is, and let's face it, most people understand who Picasso is. If you know what Picasso is, the idea behind this is I've took the author of the quote and embedded him into the visual by showing a simple visual image of Picasso. And I've done exactly the same transformation here. I've taken something that's muddy, that's not really understood, that's a mess, essentially. Again, I've taken the elements. And then on the right-hand side, I've moved those elements into an understanding, into something that people can instantly recognize and something that looks complete. The idea behind this quote being that everything you can imagine is real. So we take the elements that are unimaginable on the left and turn them into something that's recognizable, that looks real. This is why a transformation style image is so powerful, because in these types of images, you are solving the puzzle for the viewer. There is nothing left for the viewer to work out. It shouldn't take them any more than a second to understand what's going on here, because we have started with the beginning of the puzzle and we have transformed through to the solution. And all the viewer has to do is make the connection between the two images. It's why they're so powerful. And let's move back to another visualized value concept. And actually, this was originally done by Carl Richards' Behavior Gap, but Jack remodeled it and did it in his classic, amazing visualized value style. And this is an idea of zooming out. This is an idea of looking at something over decades instead of days. On the left-hand side, this is what looking over something, a progression, for example, looking over our learning or some kind of progression over a series of days looks like. But when we look at it over a series of decades, when we zoom out, the line is just nice and perfect. It's just nice and straight and going in an upwards trajectory. This is another classic example of the transformation style visual. We are giving a messy thing on the left-hand side and we're saying it's days. And we're giving something that looks really clean on the right hand side, and we're saying it's decades. The transformation style visuals are really, really powerful. Let's move on to another style. I really like this style. I started doing this probably a couple of months ago on Obvious, and when I did them once or twice, I noticed that they always did really, really well, almost even though the simplicity of the image is very, very straightforward. So the idea behind now you see it and now you don't is removing something unexpected to shock or surprise somebody. And when they hit the shock or surprise, they get the aha moment, they get the magic moment. And when they get the magic moment, they hit like, they hit share, or they share it with a friend, or they retweet it, or whatever. But that's the moment that we really want to get in any visual that we make. We want to get the magic moment. This is an example of one that I did fairly recently. I've done a lot of these, of the circles. I typically use dots. I use a lot of dots and then use a single dot, or I use a lot of dots on the left and use no dots on the right. That's the typical format that mine take in a now you see it and a now you don't, but I've got other examples to show you here too. And the rules for these kind of things is the first frame needs to show a lot of something. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't have to be circles with the way that I do it. And the second frame needs to remove everything or almost everything to shock somebody or surprise somebody into working out the connection between the two. In some senses, this is a reverse of the transformation. In a transformation, we're taking a mess of something and turning it into something understandable. In a now you see it and a now you don't visual, we are taking the understanding, we are taking something very neat and we are messing it back up again and hiding the solution and pulling it out from underneath somebody. It generally works best in two panels, and you need to ideally retain the same elements across both of them. Out of the visuals that we were talking about before, these are some great examples of a now you see it and a now you don't. If we start with the one that I did a while ago, the quotation that went with this was habits are more than goals. Basically, habits are better than goals. This was by Matt Kobach. And as soon as I saw the quote, I thought straight away of this. I showed on the left-hand side the habits, which is the thing you might be doing every single day of your life. And then the goals on the right-hand side is a single dot. When you look at this, you can draw your own conclusion from it, and that's partly my intention with making this visual. But I am obviously saying that goals in some way, just like Matt said, goals in some sense are worse than habits. I'm showing much less production of something on the right hand side. There is a single goal, but on the left hand side there's lots of something. So obviously somebody who's looking at this, the viewer, is going to think that habits are better than goals. This is part of what we're doing with a now you see it and a now you don't. Typically the left hand side is better than the right hand side, but not always, as we see in this next example that Visualize Value did. When making plans, think big. When making progress, think small. That is a quote from James Clear. On the left-hand side with this now you see it, now you don't, we've got a clear line that goes through to one thing. And then on the right-hand side, we're removing the entirety of the clear line and we've just got one single step. This is, again, a reverse transformation. It's a now you see it and a now you don't. And when you look at the one on the left, you think you understand what's going to happen next. And then on the right-hand side, you're surprised or shocked, because it shows something that you wasn't expecting. It shows a removal of everything that was there before, and it shows a focus on one tiny little small element of something you expected to be much bigger. It's why they're so powerful. I really like this one from Behavior Gap, from Carl Richards. It's a really simple concept. This is literally a now you don't. There isn't even a now you see it. It's just a now you don't. It's a list of things helped by worry. Oh, it's blank. And this is brilliant. This is why a now you see it and a now you don't work so well, because you expect to see lots of something, but your understanding is pulled out from underneath you immediately and you see nothing. It's why they work so well. And finally, let's finish off with one other one from Carl Richards. This is a classic now you see it, now you don't. He shows today, tomorrow and next week on the left. And then 30 years from now is just a tiny, tiny little dot on the right-hand side. There's barely anything to it. There's barely anything to see. So there's a huge contrast. And this is how a now you see it and a now you don't work so well across all of them. There's a huge contrast between the left-hand side and the right-hand side, and the whole idea behind them, the big idea behind them, is playing with the idea that there is something on the left and something on the right. There is a lot of something on the left, but very little of something on the right. Let's discuss the final visual pattern that I want to go on to. This one's a little bit harder to understand. This one's a little bit more esoteric, but it's still very, very powerful. So this is the skew on reality. This is something that I don't see visualized value do very much. It's something I don't see Carl Richards do very much either, because they're quite hit and miss. But when you get one of them right, they're amazingly powerful. So the idea behind a skew on reality is to take a well-known visual metaphor and play with the result. Provide an unexpected result from a well-known visual metaphor. I did this recently with Stephen Bartlett's quote, which was, the algorithm takes control over you. And we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail in a bit. But first of all, let's talk about the rules. So with the rules for a skew on reality, we need by necessity to show reality in some way. So use a well-known visual metaphor. Go back and watch Office Hours 2 if you don't understand what they are. Use a well-known thing that people understand to create something, an expectation that people know what's going to come next, and then create an unexpected skew on the thing that you have just created. And the result really with these is banking on something popular. It's banking on popular knowledge, pop culture or something like that. All three of these images that I've laid out here have all got some kind of collective understanding of what's going on. You can look at any of these images without any quotations and really understand what's going on. The weakest one here is the one on the left, because if you don't know what Picasso's paintings look like, you won't understand the visual. But the ones on the right, the one on the far right and the one in the middle, pretty much I'm confident that probably 95% of the global population would understand what's going on here. It's unlikely that somebody is not going to know what Twitter is, and it's very unlikely that somebody isn't going to know what a clock is. It's why, and I've spoke about this a lot on these office hours, it's why I use clocks and smiley faces so much, because they're a universal visual metaphor that pretty much everybody in the world understands. And if you can provide a skew on those visual metaphors that people understand, you get a very, very powerful visual that hits really, really hard. So let's look at the clock first of all. This quotation was "Earn with your mind, not with your time" by Naval Ravikant. And the visual is simple. It's taking a well-known visual metaphor, which is a clock, and it's providing a very tiny skew on what would be expected from a clock. So the resultant image here is basically saying you are happier when you are earning with your mind and not with your time. So I skewed the idea of a clock by basically turning the arms up, turning the hands of the clock up into a smile. It puts together two of the things I just said that I really like using, a clock and a smile, because they're universally understood, globally, internationally. You don't need to know anything else. But what makes this so powerful is the unexpected nature of it. It's a skew on reality. It's something you wouldn't normally see. You wouldn't see a clock that looked like this. It's useless as a clock, but you still understand it as a clock. It's the unexpected nature. It's the skew of this image that really makes it powerful. And then finally, we've got this image I did for Steve Bartlett. We become what the algorithm wants us to be. This has got two visual metaphors inside it. It's got a puppet, a simple puppet at the bottom, and then it's also got the bird at the top, the Twitter bird. If you don't know what Twitter is, you aren't going to understand this, but pretty much the majority of the globe understands what Twitter is. So this was taking two things that people understand perfectly, the idea of a puppet and the idea of Twitter, and smashing them together into quite an unexpected, and let's be honest, dark way. The quotation is pretty dark. We become what the algorithm wants us to be. It's suggesting an idea that we don't have control over what Twitter is going to do to us, and that's exactly what I did with the visual. Twitter controls everything we do. We are obviously the puppet in this situation. And it's another classic example of a skew on reality. We've all seen the Twitter logo, and the majority of us see it every single day if we use Twitter every single day. But we've not seen Twitter take control of a puppet. We've not really explored the idea that Twitter is controlling us. We've not really explored the idea that Twitter is controlling all of us. And that's what makes this really strong, because we see in Twitter here in a light that we never see Twitter in. We see Twitter as a positive thing. We barely ever stop to consider, well, unless you've watched The Social Dilemma, we barely ever stop to consider the negative impact of using something like Twitter. So an image like this hits really, really hard, because a skew on reality is an unexpected image. You aren't expecting to see the result. Before I go, I just want to mention these things. I'm working on a new book right this second. I've called it The Magic Visual. At the minute, the working subtitle is How to Make Visuals That Hit Like a Freight Train and Get Noticed Like a News Story. These 3 visual patterns are a very small amount of visual patterns that I'm going to be talking about in The Magic Visual. The book is going to really serve as a reference guide of how to make visuals that work, but not only work, that get you noticed, that get liked, that get shared, etc., etc. It's going to include other visual theory in there as well, like billboard thinking and how to apply my crap principles of design, many, many more visual patterns and in-depth studies, just like I've just done in this, of Jack Butcher's visualized value and Carl Richards' behavior gap, and really lots more. I'm releasing the book on March the 1st, 2021, and at the minute, the first 50 pre-orders, which are probably going to go pretty fast, the first 50 pre-orders can get the book for 50% off. The link is down at the bottom of this video. I hope you'll go buy it. The book's going to be fantastic. Well, I think it's going to be fantastic anyway. And it really is going to be a huge reference guide. If you're serious about making visuals, you'll want to get The Magic Visual.